February 3, 1957. Lions Associated. Drag Strip, Long Beach, California. The morning air was cold and damp off the Pacific, the kind of cold that makes tires slow to warm and engines slow to trust. Crews huddled around open trailers, breath visible in the early light, running through the same pre-run checklists they ran every weekend: plugs, timing, fuel lines, tire pressure. Nothing about the morning suggested it would be remembered. And somewhere in the staging lanes, a man named Emery Cook was about to do something that would haunt organized drag racing for the next 6 years. Cook wasn't famous yet. He was a hired driver behind the wheel of a nitro-burning, rear-engined roadster built and owned by a man named Red Hensley. Nobody in that staging lane thought they were about to witness history. They thought it was just another cold Sunday of eliminations. Then Cook made his first pass. 9.28 seconds, 156 miles per hour. A new track record on his very first run of the day. The crowd didn't roar. They went quiet. Not impressed quiet. The specific, uneasy quiet of people doing math in their heads and not liking the answer. His second run tied the track speed record. His third tied the world record for the quarter mile. And then, in the final round against Mickey Brown, Cook did something that shouldn't have been mathematically possible in a single afternoon. 9.80 seconds, 165.13 miles per hour. A new world record, not by a fraction of a mile per hour, the way records usually fall, but by more than 6 miles per hour out of nowhere. Officials pulled him aside before he'd even climbed out of the car, not to congratulate him, to question him. A jump that size, they said, wasn't a record. It was a red flag. In an era when speed records typically crept forward by a mile per hour, maybe 2 at a time, a 6-mile-per-hour leap in a single afternoon looked less like progress and more like a mistake somebody hadn't caught yet. They demanded he run again, immediately, to prove the number was real. Cook climbed back into the roadster, fired it up in front of a crowd that had gone from cheering to whispering, and made the pass again. The number held. Tech inspectors crawled over Hensley's roadster looking for something, anything, that would explain a leap that size. They measured the wheelbase. They checked the displacement. They pulled the valve covers and inspected the internals for anything resembling an illegal bore job or an unapproved supercharger setup. They found nothing illegal. Not one part of that car broke a single written NHRA rule, which left officials standing in the pits with a very specific kind of problem, a car that had just rewritten the record book and absolutely no rule they could point to that said it wasn't allowed to. So NHRA did something no rulebook explanation could justify. Within months, they didn't just question Cook's car. They banned the fuel that made it fast. Every fuel car in every class across the entire organization, gone. Replaced by a mandate that every NHRA-sanctioned car run on gasoline alone. And here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. The ban that followed Emery Cook's afternoon at Lions wasn't really about safety. It wasn't really about cheating. Stay with me, because what actually happened is stranger and more human than anything printed in a rulebook. Because in the next 25 minutes, I'm going to take you inside the 5 moments that forced the National Hot Rod Association's hand in 1957. 5 loopholes, gaps, and pressures that turned one driver's cold Sunday morning into the most controversial rule change in early drag racing history. Not vague legends. Not secondhand garage talk repeated at swap meets for 70 years until nobody remembers what was actually true. The actual mechanics, the actual politics, and the actual numbers behind why a fuel that nobody had technically outlawed suddenly became the most dangerous 4 letters in motorsport, NHRA. I'm going to show you how a fuel loophole nobody had closed let one team rewrite the record book in a single session using nothing but chemistry everyone had access to and nobody else was using. I'm going to show you how a timing strategy turned 3 separate records into a story that outran the officials trying to confirm it. I'm going to show you how a business fear dressed itself up as a safety rule and got written into an official rulebook as if it had always belonged there. I'm going to show you how that same rule collapsed from the inside, track by track, because the organization that wrote it never actually controlled enough of the sport to enforce it. And I'm going to show you how, within a handful of years, the very fuel that got Emery Cook's car pulled off the record books became the exact fuel every top fuel dragster on Earth runs on today. And I am going to make you a promise right now. By the time this video ends, you will understand exactly why NHRA couldn't let that dragster race again, and why banning it accomplished almost nothing they actually wanted it to accomplish. And the most uncomfortable part of that promise is this: nobody who wrote that ban actually believed it would last. Not really. Not deep down. Let's start with the loophole that made Cook's run possible in the first place, because it wasn't a secret. It was sitting in plain sight in a rulebook nobody had bothered to close. In 1957, the NHRA rulebook said almost nothing about what fuel a car could burn. Gasoline was the assumption, not the law. Most racers ran gasoline because that's what everyone around them ran, because nitromethane was expensive, harder to source, and harder to tune. It wasn't forbidden. It was just unusual. The way nobody reads the fine print of a contract everyone else has already signed the same way for years. Red Hensley's team read that fine print. They saw a rule that regulated engine displacement, wheelbase, safety equipment, and said nothing at all about the fuel in the tank. Think of it like a foot race where the rulebook specifies the shoes, the lane width, the starting position, and never once mentions how many calories you're allowed to eat for breakfast. Everyone assumes oatmeal because that's what the runner in the next lane eats, and the runner before that, going back years. Nobody wrote down that you couldn't have steak. Nobody even considered it worth writing down because nobody had shown up to the starting line and ordered steak yet. Nitromethane isn't just a stronger gasoline. It's a fuel that carries its own oxygen inside the molecule, which means an engine burning. It doesn't need nearly as much air pumped in to make the same explosion. It can make a far bigger explosion with the same amount of air. Where a gasoline engine might make somewhere in the range of 1 horsepower per cubic inch under heavy tuning, a nitro-fed engine in that era could produce close to double that from the same displacement. Hensley's Roadster wasn't running some exotic, illegal modification. It was running a fuel that quietly unlocked nearly 2 times the chemical energy per pump of the throttle, completely within the letter of the rules. Most teams in 1957 didn't run nitro for the simplest reason in the world: it was expensive. It was harder to source in the quantities racing demanded, and it was brutal on engine internals if the tune wasn't exact. A poorly tuned nitro engine could burn a piston in a single run. It required a level of mechanical trust most weekend teams simply didn't have. So gasoline wasn't a rule. It was a convenience. The racing equivalent of everyone taking the same familiar road to work every day, not because a sign told them to, but because nobody had bothered checking whether the back route was faster. Hensley's team checked. They accepted the mechanical risk, tuned around it carefully, and cashed in on a chemistry advantage that had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. That's the number that put Emery Cook in the record books in one afternoon. Not one dramatic mechanical trick, but a fuel loophole that had simply never been closed. Generating power gains north of 80 to 90% over the gasoline cars he was racing against. The result was that 9.80-second, 165.13 mile per hour run a number that didn't creep past the record, it obliterated it. And when NHRA officials pulled Cook aside afterward, they weren't looking for a broken part. They were looking for a broken rule. They inspected the engine, the chassis, the fuel system. They found nothing that violated a single word of the 1957 rulebook. Cook's car was, on paper, completely legal. But you need to understand something about what happened next, because it wasn't really about Cook's car at all anymore. It was about what his car proved was possible, and who that possibility frightened. A legal fuel choice, executed well, had just made every other team on that strip look like they were racing with one hand tied behind their back. And once other teams and other officials started to understand exactly what had happened, the story stopped being about one car and started being about what might happen if everyone figured it out at once. We've come now to the second piece of this story, and I want you to pay particular attention to how quickly a legal advantage can turn into an official crisis once enough people are watching, and once the numbers start moving faster than anyone can officially confirm them. Hensley's team didn't just chase one record that day. They chased three, back-to-back, in the same session. First, a new track elapsed time record, then a tied track speed record, then the outright world record, a mark that had stood since Bobby Alcind's set it the previous September at the NHRA Nationals in Kansas City. It was simply a timing strategy. Run early while the track was cool and the surface was fresh, before rubber buildup and rising temperatures slowed everyone else down later in the day. Cold air is denser air, and denser air means more oxygen molecules packed into every cylinder fill, a small, legal physics advantage that most teams simply never bothered to plan their whole day's schedule around. Hensley's team did. That strategy meant NHRA's regional officials had almost no time to cross-check the numbers against other tracks or other sanctioning bodies before Cook's name was already being wired out to racing press as a record holder 3 times over in one sitting. In an era before instant communication, before phones in every pit box, verifying a record meant paperwork, phone calls to other track officials, and days of confirmation. Cook's session had produced 3 separate record claims before lunchtime. By the time officials in Long Beach could even confirm what they were looking at, the story had already outrun them. Newspapers in neighboring states were printing the numbers before NHRA's own regional office had finished checking the math. That speed of confirmation, or lack of it, is exactly what turned a fast car into a genuine institutional panic. NHRA wasn't just dealing with one impressive run. They were dealing with a driver who had, in the space of a few hours, made their entire existing record book look outdated using nothing more exotic than a fuel choice they'd never bothered to regulate. Officials who had spent years building credibility around their record keeping now had to explain how 3 records fell to the same car in the same afternoon, using a fuel that wasn't even mentioned in their own tech sheets. And that panic didn't stay inside the tech inspection shed for long. It walked straight into the business offices of the men who actually ran the tracks, men who cared far less about elapsed times and far more about what those elapsed times might do to next Sunday's gate receipts. Now I need to pause here and tell you something that makes this ban genuinely different from almost every other rule change in drag racing history. The loophole that actually got closed wasn't a mechanical one. It was a financial one. And financial fear, it turns out, is a much less durable foundation for a rule than an actual measured danger, which is exactly why what happened next unfolded the way it did. NHRA in 1957 sanctioned less than a quarter of the drag strips operating in the country. The sport's business model depended on ordinary weekend racers, gasoline-class amateurs, showing up in numbers large enough to fill the grandstands and pay entry fees every Sunday. Those racers weren't chasing world records. They were chasing bragging rights against their neighbor's car and paying entry fees to do it. Track promoters watched what nitro cars like Hensley's Roadster did to that ecosystem and got nervous. If nitro dominance made the gas classes look slow and irrelevant, would weekend racers keep paying to lose? Would spectators keep buying tickets to watch the same handful of well-funded fuel teams win every single final round, while everyone else got run down early? This wasn't an irrational fear. It was a business calculation made by men who understood that a sport built entirely on amateur participation could quietly hollow itself out if the gap between the fastest cars and the average competitor grew too wide, too fast. Picture the economics from a track owner's chair. Every Sunday depends on dozens of local racers paying entry fees, most of them knowing they won't win, but showing up anyway because the competition still feels close enough to matter. Introduce a small number of nitro-fed cars running times no amateur gasoline car could ever hope to touch, and that feeling of closeness disappears. Why pay to lose by 3 seconds when losing by 3/10 used to feel like a real contest? But a business calculation and a safety regulation are not the same thing. Even when they get written into the same rulebook, using the same official language, stamped with the same official letterhead, and announced with the same tone of institutional authority. According to later accounts from people close to the decision, the ban that followed wasn't crafted by NHRA founder Wally Parks alone, weighing safety data in some quiet office. It was pushed by a group of promoters worried about the sport's business viability more than any actual safety concern, and Parks was, by several accounts, forced to go along with a decision made without his full consultation. The rule that eventually banned nitromethane across every NHRA class in 1957 wasn't really a safety rule at all. It was a business rule, wearing a safety rule's clothes, dressed up in official language about fuel cars being pulled from competition, when the real conversation happening behind closed doors was about ticket sales and entry fees. Here's the number that tells you everything about how thin that justification really was. NHRA controlled fewer than 25% of the nation's drag strips at the time they announced the ban. 3 out of every 4 tracks in the country weren't even bound by the decision in the first place. A rule that only governs 1 out of every 4 venues in an entire sport isn't really a ban at all. It's a suggestion with a letterhead attached to it, which brings us to the 4th piece of this story, the part where the ban NHRA had just written, with such official confidence, started falling apart almost as soon as the ink dried. Because a rule is only as strong as the territory it actually governs, and NHRA, as it turned out, governed far less territory than anyone in that room realized. The American Hot Rod Association, the Automobile Timing Association of America, the International Timing Association, Drag Racers Incorporated. Every rival sanctioning body kept nitro completely legal the entire time NHRA's ban was in effect. Independent, non-NHRA strips simply kept running fuel cars because nothing stopped them. Fans didn't stop wanting to see the fastest cars in the country. They just went wherever those cars were still allowed to race, and they took their ticket money with them. Within a single season, the erosion started. Paradise Mesa returned to nitro before 1957 was even finished, barely months after the ban had been announced. Kingdon did the same shortly after. Pomona allowed alcohol before year's end and reopened to full nitro competition by 1959. This wasn't a coordinated rebellion. It was dozens of individual track owners, each one looking at an empty Sunday grandstand and a competitor drag strip up the road that was still packing spectators in for fuel racing, and quietly deciding the ban wasn't worth the revenue it was costing them. Track by track, NHRA's own member strips walked the ban back, 1 weekend at a time, because the alternative was watching their grandstands empty out while the strip down the road sold out on fuel cars. NHRA had written a rule. It didn't have the market power to actually enforce. Controlling less than a quarter of the country's drag strips meant the other 3/4 were free to simply ignore the entire episode. The ban wasn't defeated by a lawsuit or a formal protest filed with the sanctioning body. It was defeated by empty parking lots on one side of town and full ones on the other. We've come now to the final piece of this story, and I want you to pay particular attention to this one, because unlike every other rule in this video, this one was never permanently banned again. Everything that came before this chapter was about a rule being written and then quietly failing. This chapter is about what the sport built once it finally stopped fighting. By the early 1960s, NHRA quietly reopened its doors to nitromethane. Not with fanfare, not with an apology, just a rule change, reversing the rule change as if the whole episode had been a brief detour rather than a defining crisis. Officially, the sport called it a return to fuel classes. Unofficially, it was an admission that the ban had never actually worked. And what happened after that reversal is the part that actually matters. Nitromethane didn't just come back as one legal option among many, tolerated quietly in a corner of the rulebook. It became the entire foundation of the sport's fastest categories. Every top fuel dragster and every funny car racing under NHRA sanction today runs on nitromethane blends. Modern regulations even specify exact percentage caps. A maximum around 90% nitro to methanol as of recent rulebooks. Not because the organization is still afraid of the fuel, but because it now trusts the fuel enough to regulate its exact chemistry instead of banning its existence. The organization eventually stopped fighting the fuel Emery Cook had exposed as unstoppable and started building its entire premier class around it. Think about what that means. The fuel that got a legal car pulled aside for suspicion in 1957, questioned, rerun, and inspected for a violation that didn't exist, is the same fuel that defines the single fastest, most prestigious class in the sport nearly 7 decades later. Top fuel dragsters today run quarter-mile times. That would have been physically unthinkable to the officials standing in that pit lane at Lions. All of it built on the exact chemistry they once tried to erase from the sport entirely. NHRA didn't defeat nitromethane. It surrendered to it slowly, one reopened track at a time, and then built a cathedral around the very thing it had once called a threat. Here's what I want you to sit with after this video ends. 5 things happened in the space of a few years that all trace back to one cold February morning at Lions Drag Strip. A fuel loophole nobody had closed, a record-stacking strategy that outran the officials trying to verify it, a business fear dressed up as a safety concern, a ban that collapsed under its own lack of enforcement power, and a fuel that was never successfully kept out of the sport for good. None of it required Emery Cook or Red Hensley to break a single written rule. Every part of this story came from one team reading the actual rulebook instead of the unwritten assumptions everyone else had quietly agreed to follow. Notice something about all 5 of these moments. None of them involved a raid, a lawsuit, or a courtroom fight. Nobody had to sue NHRA to get nitromethane back on the track. The fuel simply outlasted the fear that tried to erase it. One grandstand at a time, one track owner's ledger at a time, until the organization that wrote the ban quietly became the organization that built an entire sport around the thing it once banned. So ask yourself, how many rules that feel absolute today are really just habits nobody has questioned yet? How much of what gets labeled cheating in any competitive field is actually just somebody reading the instructions more carefully than the people who wrote them? And when an institution bans something out of fear instead of demonstrated danger, how long does that ban usually survive? First contact with reality? A season? A decade? Or does it always, eventually, quietly reverse itself the way this one did? Emery Cook wasn't the richest driver in drag racing, and Red Hensley wasn't running the best-funded team on the strip that February morning. They weren't factory-backed. They weren't chasing headlines. What separated them from every other team running gasoline out of habit was a specific kind of intellectual stubbornness, a refusal to accept that the unwritten way things had always been done carried the same weight as an actual rule printed on an actual page. There's a line attributed to drivers of that era, passed down through paddock conversation more than any official record, something to the effect of, "The rule book only stops you where it's actually written down. Everywhere else is just everyone agreeing to be slower than they have to be." Whether anyone said it in exactly those words, in exactly that pit lane, is disputed. Nobody wrote it down at the time. Racing history from the 1950s rarely came with a court stenographer, but the sentiment belongs to that entire generation of racers who kept finding gaps nobody had bothered to close, who treated a silent rule book as permission rather than prohibition. His point, and theirs, was never that rules don't matter. Rules matter enormously. They're the reason drag racing has survived 7 decades without collapsing into chaos or catastrophe. His point was that most of the rules we treat as permanent, unquestionable, handed down from the mountain absolute, were only ever temporary agreements, written by people who were afraid, in one specific moment, of what might happen if they didn't write them down fast enough. Fear is a reasonable starting point for a rule. It's a much shakier foundation for keeping one in place for 70 years. The fuel loophole nobody closed. The record-stacking strategy that outran the officials. The business fear disguised as a safety concern. The ban with no real enforcement power behind it. And the fuel that was never successfully kept out of the sport for good, eventually becoming the very foundation of its fastest, most celebrated class. 5 moments, 1 dragster, 1 cold February morning at Lyons Drag Strip, and a sport that spent the better part of 70 years slowly, quietly admitting it had banned exactly the wrong thing. Because in the end, this was never really just a story about racing or nitromethane or one driver's afternoon at a Southern California drag strip. It's a story about what happens every single time an institution, any institution, in any industry, in any era, decides it would rather ban the thing that scares it than sit with the harder, more honest admission that it simply wasn't ready for what that thing had already proven was possible.